Welcome, everyone, and thank you to those that are joining us today. I'm Dr. Tim McGinnis. I'm the Managing Director of the Society of Citizens Against Relationship Scams, and I'm extraordinarily pleased to be able to speak today with Dr. Tom Sorell, who is a leading philosopher, ethicist involved in the area of cybercrime, associated financial fraud, etc. Tom, perhaps you can introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about your background.
Sure, I'll be glad to. I work on broadly on ethical issues in technology, and I've done a lot of work on cybersecurity, from terrorism to scamming and related phenomena. The work that I've done in this area really stems from a project that was funded in the UK from 2016 to 2018, that was funded by an engineering research council. It was a multidisciplinary project that looked into various means of identifying romance scamming behavior on romance websites and in various other online areas. Some of it was based on AI, on the identification of patterns in some of the prompts used by scammers, as well as some of the scripts used by scammers. There was quite a lot of innovation in the identification of patterns in those scripts, and also the way that advertising of possible romance partners was done, the patterns in the semantics of those things, for example. It was an interdisciplinary project, and I was involved as a philosopher. So I was interested in some of the areas where philosophy and psychology complement one another. One of those areas is in the rationality of certain kinds of behavior. So we were interested in some of the things that are sometimes said about scamming victims and some of the rationality of their behavior, for example. But I also became interested in scam baiting, another phenomenon that's related to scamming. I was also interested in the ethics and justifiability of that, and also its rationality at times. In both these cases, I was interested in the psychological literature as well as applying philosophy to it.
Okay. Thank you very much. Appreciate it very much that you joined me today. What I'd like to begin with is to start with the topic of victim blaming that you're eminently familiar with, to have you share your views and perhaps have a conversation about the differences in your perspective versus those of our organization. As I've mentioned previously, we've interacted with in excess of 9 million victims since our organization was founded at the beginning of 2015. And we've had over 12,000 individuals go through our support and recovery program with a very substantial success rate. And we measure success in a couple of different ways. One of the ways in which we measure success in recovery is, one, that they avoid the suicidal and self-harm ideation, that they avoid recidivism and being defrauded again, that they substantially recover their quality of life and learn to both process grief and manage their trauma successfully. In all cases, we strongly recommend and have from the onset that victims recognize that this is a traumatic experience, and that in addition to education and support, that they should be seeking proper professional psychological support, counseling, therapy as a part of the recovery process. But obviously, the topic of victim blaming is near and dear to our heart. We communicate aggressively to all victims that this was not their fault.
Mm.
They should not blame themselves. They should not feel shame and guilt associated with these crimes, that they were expertly groomed and manipulated and controlled. We certainly wouldn't tell a 5-year-old who was the victim of a pedophile that they were to blame for being lured, groomed, and controlled in much the same psychological mechanisms that are applied to scams. Could you talk about your views on that?
Sure. I think again, my views are partly led by the psychological findings. My colleague Monica Whitty, who was at Warwick University at the time we started this work, she's done a lot of work on all aspects, I think, of romance scamming. But one of the things she was interested in was the pattern of interaction between a scamming victim and a scammer, from seeing someone's profile on a romance site, to being love bombed, through to being exposed to various emergencies that the scamming persona is supposed to be involved in, making various payments and so on. The sort of baseline for what we were discussing together, what we were both bringing our different disciplines to bear on, was this pattern of, increasing involvement by the scam victim with the scammer persona. So one of the things that we had been told about by, for example, citizens advice bureaus who are sometimes approached by scam victims, and also by the police in the UK, we were told of incidents where money was about to be transferred, where a scam victim was at that moment on the phone with a scammer. A policeman was there present while this was going on and telling the scam victim that the person she was going to transfer money to was a scammer, and the scam victim insisting, despite all of that, and the money transfer agencies warning her and so on, insisting on, despite all of that, that she was going to go ahead and do that. So one of the sort of naive questions that we were interested in seeing the depth of was the question, why do people do that? And when people ask the question, why do people do that, they mean that they take for granted that there's a standard of rationality or a pattern of thinking that somebody who was not being victimized and not being sucked into a scam would be able to go through, and that people who fall victim to scams are unable to go through. And perhaps, what we're talking about there in a kind of abbreviated way is grooming, and the way in which love bombing, so to speak, imposes a frame of mind and a pattern of thinking.
May I interrupt you for a second?
Sure.
When you're talking about love bombing, are you meaning what we know as the amygdala hijack process?
Yes, I guess it lends itself to that description. But what I mean by it, just to be clear on where I'm coming from, I mean a stage shortly after the scam victim has first approached the scammer persona through a romance website. The scammer takes the conversation off the romance website and usually onto an SMS type of environment, and literally bombards the scam victim with messages, sometimes romantic messages declaring love ardently, perhaps also sends gifts, and really just monopolizes someone's attention and affections in a very intense way early on in the relationship. That's one of the stages that that seems to be typical. And I guess what we're interested in is this grooming process, and we're interested in who might be vulnerable to it, and that's something that Monica had ideas about, and also whether there's a certain sense in which it has its own rational standards that are a little bit different from the standards one would follow if one were protecting one's own interests against a possibly hostile external world. So what we argue in this joint paper that we wrote is that if the norms that govern the relationship between the scam victim and the scam persona, the persona built by the scammer, if the norms that govern that are the norms of love, then there are certain ways in which the ordinary norms of rationality, prudential rationality, are abandoned. In other words, when one is romantically involved with someone and one is asked to think badly of them, one isn't supposed to stop and say, well, what's the evidence against him? One's first reaction morally is supposed to be, no, I don't want to hear that. I'm loyal and devoted to someone. I won't hear that kind of charge against them. I refuse to believe it, because that's a way of expressing loyalty. It's a way of expressing love in a certain sense. So I think one of the things that we're trying to put forward there is that from a philosophical point of view, it's not that people lose their agency, people who are groomed. It's that they are put into a frame of mind in which different norms prevail. Those norms are norms of extreme loyalty, norms of sticking with people despite the evidence, thinking the best of them, the same kinds of norms that apply when romantic love, and even in the love of one's children, where one's loyal to them before one thinks badly of them. Those kinds of norms prevail because of the process of grooming. And those norms, so to speak, counterbalance the ordinary prudential norms that people outside the scamming relationship are trying to impose on the scamming victim. So people outside the scammer's relationship with the victim are saying, don't you see, this guy's a scammer, he only wants to get money from you. And from within the kind of loving relationship where you won't hear bad things being said about the person one loves, one's already, so to speak, immunized against prudence. So that's a way in which philosophy and psychology combine to show that there's a kind of curious logic to the way one thinks as a result of grooming. It's not that what the scamming victim does is inappropriate, because they're in love, as we say. What's actually the case is that they are sticking to norms that we all stick to in various kinds of relationships. It's just that in most of the relationships we engage in, we do know whom we're in love with, and we don't have this grooming and manipulation going on. So if that different logic, the logic of love and loyalty, if that logic is what's prevalent in the scam victim relationship, it's not that people take leave of their senses and become totally hoodwinked. It's that they try to do the right thing morally, and that trying to do the right thing morally ends in their colluding in their own harm, in harm to themselves. That kind of paradoxical relationship is, that kind of paradoxical logic is one of the things that shows how clever romance scamming is, because it creates a loyalty that makes the scam victim impervious to the operation of evidence.
Thank
That's
you.
the approach that we have. And what Monica adds to this is that she is able to produce evidence of different kinds of personality types being engaged by romance scams. And some of these personality types have distinctive kinds of behavior online. Some of those people prefer to construct an online persona of themselves, which they think presents them in a good light. And they prefer online communication to, as it were, participating in the meat market of ordinary dating, where they present themselves in a face-to-face meeting and are judged, according to how much they weigh or how old they are or something of the sort, and where they feel that their personality is entirely missed. So you have a lot of forces operating in a romance scam, and one of the claims we were making was that you need the resources of philosophy and psychology to bring out what's going on in these cases.
Excellent. Thank you so much for explaining that. To what extent do you view, if there is a change in that morality, for example, in the case of abusive relationships? For example, we know that in the case of domestic abuse, that you have all of the characteristics of a romance scam in a groomed and manipulated relationship that turns abusive, and that victim, that domestic abuse victim, it demonstrates the same kind of challenges and difficulties in breaking away from that we see in traditional romance scam victims as well. And we also see that in the evolution of romance scams, where gaslighting and more overt control mechanisms take place to harvest the victim's money. Were you able to factor those into the research that you were doing?
No, we weren't. We weren't in the work we were doing at the time. But I take your point. I mean, from what I know about domestic abuse situations, it seems to me that some of the mechanisms may be a little different. I agree that there's quite a strong analogy in some cases between what appears to be the collusion of the victim in the maintenance of the situation that kind of that sort of is the platform for the abuse. I see that, and that is a kind of prima facie irrationality. But from my understanding of the way some domestic abuse works, the partner, often a woman, will be financially very dependent on the man, so that it isn't obvious to her how she could leave the relationship and still support herself or support her children very often. So those financial ties and financial dependence is one of the things that's operating. I think that other things operate too. For example, it may be thought by the victim in these kinds of situations that the violent partner goes through phases or has different sides to their personality, and that if she were to launch into prosecution of this person, or support a prosecution of this person, that would be to deny the side of this person's personality that she's in love with, or that that she thinks has redeeming value or something of the sort. I think that that's a point of strong analogy with the kind of thing I was talking about in the case of scamming victims. I do agree this is an extremely interesting area, but it also seems to me that you could say that in a lot of cases, a prudential rationality also is used in arriving at the conclusion that one should stay with the abusive partner, and that prudential reasoning might operate through, the consequences financially of separation. So it's not it's not quite the same, I think, as people in a sort of captivity to a particular image of someone. I think in the romance scamming case, where a persona has been really effectively created, people are kind of at the mercy of this persona. If they lose it, they grieve for it, and so on. And maybe that's the case in some domestic violence, but I imagine in some domestic abuse, but I imagine that in other cases of domestic abuse, people are quite sort of make a calculation about what the consequences would be of leaving, and sometimes conclude that it would be worse, if not for the victim, the partner, for the partner and the children. So I think there are some disanalogies, but I agree that there is this common core of an odd logic.
We find that in about 22% of the cases, victims are reluctant to leave because of active threats made by the criminals. And in addition, one of the things that many of the criminals will do with their victims is to promise to repay them, as both a mechanism to draw out more money. Don't worry, we're going to pay you back. But then the victim gets into this cognitive bias of chasing the money, so to speak, where they're reluctant to leave, believing that the criminal is going to, in fact, pay them back.
Yeah. Yeah.
So it has those things in common with domestic abuse.
I agree. And in one of the examples, one of the cases that Monica took from her, empirical data, a woman started out by being scammed in the ordinary way, and when that was exposed, the scammer admitted he was a scammer, and said, and approached the victim just as a business partner and said, "Yeah, I'm a scammer, but I'm going to be making money from this business deal I've got somewhere. Do you want to join in? That's my way of kind of compensating you for what I've done with you so far." And it was interesting but unusual, given the range of cases Monica brought to my attention. That wasn't typical, but I agree that there are sometimes cases where you play different roles, or you occupy, sometimes cooperative and sometimes uncooperative roles, but not always for romantic reasons, sometimes for other kinds of reasons that are more self-interested. That's another dimension of this. Yeah.
Okay. In the time that we have left, perhaps we can switch over to another topic.
Yeah.
Which is near and dear to my heart, which is the propensity of many victims when they come out of the scam. They're going through a period of sort of traumatic readjustment, and the realization that they're the victim of a crime. And for many victims, they certainly fall into denial, and whatever that spectrum of emotions is, they essentially go away. Another, a little over a third, we find sort of immediately go to their default of some form of the spectrum of anger. And this often leads to a vigilante mentality. a need for revenge, a need to get even, a need for vengeance, and that this can result in several manifestations, such as the endless desire of naming and shaming of these criminals, believing that this somehow will translate into criminal justice, which our own studies and experience does not go there at all. It's essentially a futility, or a potentially more dangerous extreme known as scam baiting, where the victim becomes involved almost as a vigilante to lure out an attempt to compromise these criminals, never taking into consideration that some of these criminals are part of very large, and in some cases, such as Chinese cartels, the Nigerian Black Axe, some of the Latin American scammer organizations based out of Brazil and others, that they in fact can be dangerous. Now, our own awareness is we're not aware of a single case of scam baiting that has led to an arrest. Now, we are aware of some hacking where hackers have hacked into the CCTV system of Indian call centers and Asian call centers and turned that over to the police, and it's resulted in arrests. But those are qualitatively and mechanically and technologically completely two different activities. What are your views and findings on this topic? Would you share with us what your belief is and philosophical takes are on these topics?
Yes, I have thought about scam baiting a bit. I think scam baiting is very interesting, and it's interesting partly because because vigilantism is very interesting, and vigilantism is very, although there's a small philosophical literature on vigilantism which predates online vigilantism. Even the literature on vigilantism, ordinary vigilantism, is very small, and vigilantism is a kind of paradoxical phenomenon itself, because often people are enforcing a law. It's not just enforcing their own likes and dislikes, but it's enforcing a law that they think is imperfectly enforced by the officials who are responsible for enforcing the law. So it's not as if many vigilantes think that they're operating against the grain of police activity. On the contrary, they think they are helping the police or doing what the police are not able to do because of silly restrictions that favor criminals. When it comes to scam baiting, online scam baiting, I think there's a kind of convergence of two phenomena. One phenomenon is the one you just mentioned, where people who have themselves been scammed want to take revenge, and they do that by trying to get back at scammers or the scammers that have harmed them. But the other thing that goes on is where people who like online gaming use this as a sort of outlet for a passion they pursue independently of any harm that's been done to them. And of course, if you engage in this kind of gaming online, you can even feel happy that you're actually getting back at people who've harmed other people. So it has this kind of moral sheen, even if the real motivation for it is just a liking for gaming. So I think that convergence of online gaming with wanting to get revenge in cases where one's been harmed oneself is interesting and part of what's going on with scam baiting. But I think the bottom line about scam baiting, quite apart from scam victims, is that it's a form of vigilantism, and vigilantism has a lot wrong with it. Among the things that are very wrong with vigilantism is that you can harm the entirely innocent. You can charge people who've never done anything wrong. You can charge them with pedophilia, or you can charge them with scamming, and you can easily be mistaken. That's the first thing. The second thing is that you can treat different people who've done the same thing inconsistently, unlike courts. Maybe you happen to find one of these scammers likable and you let them off. Either way, you're not really enforcing law anymore. So there's a sense in which vigilantism degrades the enforcement of law. It's not a more effective enforcement of law. It's a sort of degraded form of the enforcement of law. Perhaps it degenerates into something that's not the enforcement of law at all. So those things that are wrong with vigilantism, and there are more things that are wrong with it than I've mentioned, but those things that are wrong with vigilantism rub off on scam baiting. What's interesting about scam baiting, though, in some forms, in a paper I've written about this, I've taken the case of the website called 419 Eater, which is to do with gaming, scam baiting with respect to 419 scammers. The 419 scam in Nigeria. This is the scam where you're invited to take a very large amount of money into your bank account, but it turns out there is no such money, and in the meantime, you give details that allow people to steal some of your own money. Well, what's interesting about 419 scammer activity is that they have an ethical code where there are certain things that they do not allow themselves to do. So they do not allow themselves actually to punish physically scammers. They don't allow scam baiters to go and get money from scammers. They draw the line at that. They do allow for trophy photographs of scammers. But what they like above all is to conduct an extended chat with scammers that will look to a Western audience to be extremely absurd and laughable. That is, will make the scammers look laughable, but that will be extremely amusing to a sort of secondary audience, not of scammers, but of other people who are scam baiters. And the way they think about it is that the worst that's done is that scammers have their time wasted. And
let me ask you a question then.
Yeah.
That I think is at the core of this. Now, remember that our organization is a victims assistance and services organization.
Yes.
So our orientation is all about helping victims to recover from these crimes.
Yeah. Yeah.
So there's two aspects to this that are particularly problematic to us.
Mm-hmm.
One is the profound impact that any form of vigilantism has on the victim's ability to emotionally recover, to allow them to process grief normally and learn how to manage trauma, because it has a profoundly modifying effect on those. The second is that, in effect, scam baiting, from the question of ethics, is essentially allowing scam baiters, vigilantes, to use the same criminal techniques.
Mm-hmm.
And looked at in black and white, they're doing exactly what the scammers are doing. They're engaging in wire fraud, potentially bank fraud. They're lying over an electronic communication medium. In other words, that scam baiting, in effect, is a form of fraud, but it's being used by the vigilante and justified by the vigilante as a way of, as you say, wasting the scammer's time. But the truth is, as we see it,
yes,
that all of the scam baiting combined in the world has not even impacted 1% of the scammers that are operating in the world. We've been seeing numbers since 2020 that exceed 1 million arrests a year.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I'm the first one to say that China is responsible for the majority of the arrests in the world. They're cleaning out. But this didn't happen until our organization set up shop in China, and we had meetings with their Minister of State Security, who wasn't even aware that romance scams were a thing.
Yeah.
But our principal objection is the ethical objection that it takes someone who is essentially, in most cases, either a victim or a non-victim and gives them agency to commit fraud online, regardless of whether it is in a criminal case.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
nothing that they're doing is evidence that could be used in a court of law anyway.
Yes. I think you're right. I think that, I think what I'm calling attention to is completely consistent with what you're saying. I think that there are versions of scam baiting, which are interesting because they're unusual. There are instances of scam baiting where the people doing it are not former victims of scams, and where there are particular rules to doing it that limit the amount of fraud, that limit the amount of harm. Of course, that doesn't mean that people don't misrepresent themselves, but they're not trying to get money out of people in the way that scammers do. But that's completely consistent with saying that for the most part, scam baiters would have no scruples about doing that, and if they were able to get money from scammers, all the better. And when they send scammers off to very dangerous safaris, as the terminology goes in scam baiting, they like that too, even if it puts scammers in mortal danger. They're perfectly happy to do that. So I agree that even this activity, which sometimes aims only at wasting the time of the scammers and doing so humorously for an observing audience, that there's no guarantee that that's going to be kept within limits. This is one of the characteristics of vigilantism, that there's nothing to keep it on the rails. It can go off the rails and still be what it is. It's still scam baiting if it's very extreme. It doesn't have a lot of constraints. There are no procedures that you get in the case of law. So it's true that a lot of this is detached from trying to get convictions. It's not like pedophile hunting, where you assemble the evidence and then give a chat log to a police force.
Right.
Part of the problem is that the jurisdictions in which these folks operate, especially in West Africa, are completely compromised anyway. They're easy. These scammers are easily able to bribe their way out of prosecution. But the point you make is absolutely right, that this isn't an effective way of getting back at folks. It often involves doing some of recreating the harm, spreading the harm, being infected by the motivation of the scammers themselves. There's plenty wrong with it, and whether it has a therapeutic effect, given those things, that is, given the ethical shortcomings of this practice, is a very good question. I think that's what you're calling attention to.
There's another aspect to this which I find disturbing from a philosophical point of view,
Mm-hmm.
and that is the dehumanization. So in the work that we do, we try to help victims understand that scammers are not monsters. They're normal human beings engaged in a terrible thing.
Yeah.
A bit like the Nazi concentration camp guards. We're not talking about the Mengele types, but the guards that manned the gate. They were normal human beings that are engaged in a terrible activity that literally kills victims.
Yeah.
And that another aspect of scam baiting is it dehumanizes these individuals, which we very much want to have arrested. And frankly, our organization has worked with the former director of EFCC
Mm,
until he was arrested this year with great success, record
mm,
numbers for the last 2 years,
mm,
suggesting strategies and working with them in data sharing and other types of things. But this dehumanization, converting them to an other, is something that we try to help victims move away from, so that they're not turning the criminals into a cartoon character, that they just recognize them as one thing and one thing only. They're a human being. They are a criminal, period. And that this philosophical understanding does, in fact, in our experience, allow the victims to set aside their animosity, their anger, and their rage, and arrive at a point where eventually not only can they forgive themselves for the crime, but in the tradition of many philosophies, they're able to forgive the criminal for the act that they're engaged in. And I think
mhm.
scam baiting precludes any possibility of this.
Yeah. Um, well, I think that there's a lot of complexity if one looks at the context for all of this. I mean, there's no getting away from the fact, as far as 419 scams go, that the scammers are uh, uh, from Africa. Um, they uh, they are very excluded economically in the countries that they live in. Um, there's no equal opportunities in these countries. There's no properly functioning legal system. Um, and what's more, these folks feel sometimes excluded from the rich Western world, even if they want just to engage in ordinary conversation with people from the West. They tend to be denigrated. There's some sociological evidence that's part of what's going on here. But in other words, that some scamming is justified to the scammers, by the scammers, as a kind of getting back at a rich world that excludes them and that has in the past exploited them. What I worry about with that way of thinking about the whole thing is that it also homogenizes victims. I mean, it's not just that scam baiting ends up dehumanizing the criminals. It's also that scamming ends up dehumanizing victims. It's
Indeed.
just it's the criminals think, you know, all the people who are defrauded of money are rich, white, ex-colonial types who deserve, to have some of their money taken away from them. If that's the kind of story that they're telling, they haven't got a clue about the sort of terrible financial straits that they leave many scam victims in. So that happens on both sides, and it seems to me that if one thinks about the ethics of scamming, as well as the crime of scamming, there's plenty to be said about that as well. It's not just the dehumanization of the criminal, but it's the dehumanization of the victim, and that a lot of that is going on at the hands of the scammers. Worse, they actually engage in a kind of psychological manipulation that makes the losses to the victims much greater than the mere financial losses,
Oh, of course.
because of all the grief that's associated with finding out that a persona you love doesn't exist.
Indeed. All right. So we're coming up on the top of the hour, and I don't
Yep.
want to impose too much more of your time. So I want to thank you tremendously. This has been a great conversation, and we appreciate it a great deal. And I hope that there is an opportunity for you to continue with these lines of research, particularly areas that we find challenging, such as the ethics of some of these activities, particularly vigilantism, and some of the world of mistaken beliefs regarding how victims can and should be helped and cared for. So I want to thank you for this. And do you have any upcoming research that you're publishing?
I'm hoping to write a book about vigilantism that includes work on scam baiting and includes work on a whole range of things that's connected with vigilantism. That's a project over the next couple of years. As soon as I get some time off from the funded research I'm doing, I'll try to write this book. But I've really enjoyed the conversation, Tim, and I hope we'll be able to talk again or maybe even collaborate.
Excellent. I thank you for your time.
Not at all.
Let me conclude this by saying this has been a presentation of the Society of Citizens Against Relationship Scams. You can find us at againstscams.org. Reach us by email at contact@againstscams.org. So thank you, Tom, for joining me today, and I will wish you a great rest of your week.
Thank you, and I'll be in touch with Monica.
Excellent. Thank you.